Ladies and gentlemen.
Well, hiya, Fuddly, old boy, old boy, old boy. Where you been keeping yourself?
Shh. Quiet. Can't you see that I'm about to introduce the program?
Ah, don't get so huffy. You might at least say hello or how's tricks or something like that.
Indeed. Well, I'll have you know that such nonsensical language is an insult to one's intelligence. It's nothing but noise.
Oh, yeah? Noise, huh? Well, it's a lot more than that.
It is not.
It is too. Well, you know, Well, it looks like Fuddly won't introduce the program after all. He's temporarily unconscious. I mean, indisposed.
Oh.
Quiet down there. Anyway, folks, this here is a program called Language in Action. And here to start the action is Dr. S.I. Hayakawa.
Thank you for the introduction, Crashaw. But you fellows had better take it easy, or you're not going to last through the series. I wonder if you recall the Mother Goose rhyme, two little dogs sat by the fire over a fender of coal dust. Said one little dog to the other little dog, if you don't talk, why, I must. And I recall this Mother Goose rhyme to your mind because I want to discuss today a curious question. Why is it that human beings find it necessary to talk in spite of the fact that often they have nothing to say? What complicates the whole problem of the interpretation of language so very greatly is the fact that intermingled and fused with are symbolic ways of using language to report external facts and communicate information, are older and more primitive uses of language which we have almost in common with the lower animals. That is, in our lower animals, we can estimate their states of mind by the fact that they grunt or they growl or they whimper or they snarl, and we regard these noises as sort of external expressions of internal conditions. In a similar way, human beings use language in this way too, as external expressions of internal feelings, not to refer to something in the objective world, but simply to give expression to what's inside them. For example, when we say, ouch, my tooth hurts, notice that the ouch is simply an expression of internal condition, whereas the my tooth hurts would be a report. And inextricably fused with all our scientific and factual and informative language, then, are these fundamentally almost animalistic uses of words in which we are simply expressing internal conditions. Supposing a young man says about a young lady, she's the sweetest girl in all the world. Is he making a statement about the girl? I should say not. He is simply making a statement about how he feels about her. It can be a little more complicated than that. Supposing you read an editorial in which there's an angry denunciation of, let's say, Reds or Wall Street or monopolists or radicals or whatever. The editorial goes on, let's say, and because of its syntactical and grammatical structure built up into big, long sentences, we may feel that something quite verifiable, or at least arguable, is being said, when actually what may be happening is simply that the editorial is one long continuous snarl at those individuals or those groups against which the editorial is directed. And in that case, we might say that these are snarl words rather than than informative uses of language altogether. Similarly, when you say, she's the sweetest girl in all the world, or use expressions like sweetie pie and honey bunch and so on, are these not sort of purr words in which you are saying nothing informative about the subject of your sentence, but simply expressing an internal condition of pleasure or delight or affection? In other words, then, these snarl words and purr words may be regarded as vocal equivalents of expressive gestures. By expressive gestures, I mean crying in pain, or baring the teeth in anger, or nuzzling others in friendship or loneliness, or dancing with delight. And when we use words, then, as vocal equivalents of these expressive gestures, we can say that language in that case is being used in pre-symbolic ways.
Hey, Budley, have you been listening to what the doc's been saying here? It's kind of interesting. Hey, where did that character go to? Ow!
Budley, you're stepping a little out of character, aren't you?
On the contrary, sir, I'm simply trying to knock a little character into this character.
Well, as the way Crashaw had of saying "oh" indicates, the very loudness and tone of voice in which any utterance is made is a pre-symbolic element in speech and highly expressive of the degree of emotion with which a given utterance is invested. For example, if you carelessly step off a curb when a car is coming along, it doesn't matter what you say, whether you say "look out" or "watch out" or "prongard" or "kiochke" or whatever you say. The important thing is that you say it loudly enough to create attention and cause a reaction. So that the loudness or tone of voice is, I should say, one of the most important pre-symbolic elements in speech. To take another example, supposing some enchanted evening you're strolling in a garden with a beautiful young lady and she says, "the moon is bright tonight." How do you know she's not simply making a meteorological observation, but indicating that she wants to be kissed? And how do we acquire this ability to interpret and evaluate tones of voice in speech? I should say it goes back to our earliest childhood experience when we were mere infants. And we had mothers who talked to us, and we, as infants, of course, we didn't understand her speech, but we did understand through her tone of voice whether that she felt warmly towards us, loved us, were concerned, or were irritated. Whatever it was, we evaluated from tone of voice long before we could understand the words. And as adults, we retain to a large degree this capacity for evaluating other people's emotions in terms of the tones of voice in which they speak. And this, I should say, is perhaps the most fundamental and most important pre-symbolic element in language. And then to go back to this whole question of why we talk when there isn't anything particular to say, think of what goes on at tea parties, cocktail parties, receptions, and so on, in which large numbers of people have nothing particularly to say to each other, but nevertheless everybody's chattering madly. And what do they talk about? Nothing very profound as a rule. They may discuss the position of the Chicago White Sox, Peter DeVries's latest novel, Audrey Hepburn's latest picture, but never the discussion never gets very profound. They're just talking in order to make a noise. Are they really communicating? In many cases not. It's a kind of verbal nuzzling by means of which people exhibit their friendliness for each other. And the important thing about this is that although the intellectual may say, oh, they're wasting their time, why don't they say something? If you're going to have nothing to talk about, why talk at all? In a sense, they are not wasting their time, because notice that if you go to such a party and refuse to talk, that itself would have meaning. You would be regarded as being quite rude, as trying to avoid being friendly. And from these social practices, I suppose it's possible to elicit a general principle that perhaps one of the most important functions of speech is the mere prevention of silence. And I'd like to call your attention to the fact that this kind of social conversation has special rules of its own. Whenever we enter into a social conversation, notice that we are careful to select subjects about which immediate agreement is possible. And people have often asked, why do people so often talk about the weather? Well, the reason they do is that if it's raining, it's so easy to say, quite a rain we're having, isn't it? And it's so easy for the other person to say, yes, it is. And the idea basically is to elicit agreement from the other person to show that you're being friendly. So you say, nice day, isn't it? And they say, yes, it is a nice day. That's one agreement. And so you say next, altogether we've had a very nice summer, don't you think? And the other person says, yes, we've had a very nice summer indeed, and that's two agreements. We had a very nice spring, too, this year, didn't we? Oh, yes, it was a very lovely spring. That's three agreements. And step by step, then, we build up these little agreements. So what do we agree about? We agree about the weather. We agree that it's too bad prices are going up. We agree that, oh, New York's a nice place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live there, would you? They say, oh, of course, I think it's a nice place to visit, too, but I wouldn't want to live there either. And gradually, as we build up these agreements, the fear and suspicion of the stranger wears away, and the possibility of friendship emerges.
You know, Dr. Hayakawa, this matter of proceeding from agreement to agreement fascinates me. I think I'll try a little experiment here. Oh, Crashaw! Crashaw!
Hey, what do you want, you overdressed toothpick?
Well, that is, I just wanted to say that that was a good lunch we had today.
Why, yeah, it was.
Yes, and the coffee was excellent, too.
Yeah, come to think of it, it was. Hey, what's going on here? We seem to be talking without fighting. It ain't natural.
Gentlemen, maybe you'll find an explanation here in a passage I shall read you from the anthropologist Malinowski, who wrote a supplement to Ogden Richards' Meaning of Meaning. There can be no doubt that we have here a new type of linguistic use. Phatic communion, I am tempted to call it. P-H-A-T-I-C, phatic communion. A type of speech in which ties of union are created by a mere exchange of words. Let us look at it from the special point of view with which we are here concerned. Let us ask what light it throws on the function and nature of language. Are words in phatic communion used primarily to convey meaning, the meaning which is symbolically theirs? Certainly not. Always the same emphasis on affirmation and consent. They fulfill a social function, and that is their principal aim, but they are neither the result of intellectual reflection, nor do they necessarily arouse reflection in the listener. Once again, we may say that language does not function here as a means for the transmission of thought. You get that? So you were doing fine with it. In other words, you might say that the function of language used socially when there isn't much to say is perhaps to establish new lines of communication and sometimes to keep old lines of communication open. In other words, old friends like to talk to each other even when they haven't got much news to tell each other. And you'll notice that in the same way, long-distance telephone operators and ship radio officers and signal corps outposts chatter back and forth among each other even when there isn't anything special to communicate, just in order to assure themselves that the lines of communication are still open. And this, too, would account for the fact that people in offices and groups that work together chatter together even when there isn't a tremendous amount to say. I wrote a little dialogue to illustrate the problem entailed by this kind of phatic communion, describing a situation that must occur between many a married couple. Wife says, Wilbur, why don't you talk to me? Husband, interrupting in his reading. What's that? Wife, why don't you talk to me? Husband, but there isn't anything special to say. Wife, you don't love me. Husband, thoroughly interrupted and quite annoyed. Don't be silly, you know I do. Do I run around with other women? Don't I bring home my paycheck every week? Don't I work my head off for you and the kids? Wife, way out on a logical limb, but still not satisfied. Still, I wish you'd say something. Husband, well, what'll I say and why? Well, just because. Well, In a way, the husband is right. Why should he talk when there isn't anything special to communicate? But in a way, too, the wife is right. How does one know that the lines of communication are still open unless one keeps them at work one way or another? And so when a radio engineer says 1, 2, 3, 4, testing, testing, and so on, he's not really saying much, but sometimes it's very, very necessary that he say it. Another curious function of language occurs in ritual meetings of various kinds, sermons, political conventions, pep rallies, lodge meetings, and so on, at which groups of people come together to share certain accustomed activities, to wear their regalia, to have banquets together, where they display the ribbons, the flags, the emblems of their solidarity, and march in processions and so on. And included, of course, in all these ceremonies, there will always be some speeches, some ritualistic utterances. Now, a curious thing about these speeches is that they are usually full of cliches in the sense that they communicate no new information, and to an outsider, they sound fairly nonsensical. Look at what happens, for example, at a football rally prior to a football game at any American college. The players, the members of the team, are introduced to an audience who already knows them and called upon to make some speeches. These players may make some incoherent remarks, sometimes quite ungrammatical, and these remarks are cheered wildly by the audience. And the coach gets up and promises great things to be done in the game tomorrow. But the curious thing is that as the result of such a meeting and as a result of all these speeches, no information has been communicated, no news has been given out, and no one comes out of such a meeting any wiser or better informed than he was when he came in. So why do such meetings take place? Another question has to do with religious ceremonial. For example, why is it that in many churches the service is conducted in a language incomprehensible to most of the congregation, as in the case of Hebrew in Orthodox Jewish synagogues, Latin in Roman Catholic churches, Sanskrit in Chinese and Japanese temples? Obviously, if the purpose of these services was the communication of information, you'd have to use a language the audience would understand, but they do not. Now, if we examine these linguistic events not as utterances in which information and the communication of information are the purpose, but as utterances in which the reaffirmation of social loyalties are the main purpose, then it becomes clear that it does not matter that the words are incomprehensible. It does not matter that no information is communicated, because that's not what the meeting is for. Basically, the meeting is that if we are all members of the same group, we should reaffirm by going through these customary noises and the customary cliches and the customary flag waving of whatever it is, we should reaffirm our group loyalty to each other. And the good done by these ritual utterances is that when a Christian goes to such a meeting and listens to such ceremonial, he feels closer to his fellow Christians. The elk feels a closer tie to his brother elks. At a patriotic rally, an American feels more American, or a Frenchman will feel more French. In other words, societies and social groups are held together by such bonds of common reactions to accustomed sets of linguistic stimuli. So, it does not matter, therefore, that the language of ritual is sometimes meaningless, and even if meaningful, often not understood. They are accustomed sets of noises, which largely do not exist to convey information, but which exist because group feelings, group semantic reactions are attached to them. The abracadabra of a lodge meeting is absurd to anyone who is not a member of that particular lodge. In other words, when language becomes ritual, its effect becomes to a considerable degree independent of whatever semantic significance the words may once have contained.
O Ozymandias Lorbrowicus Overlordium, by the powers vested in me by the great court of Potluck II, I hereby dub thee Grand Keeper of the Mystic Candelabra. Long may its sacred tapers be lit, yea, as lit as all the members of this our secret society of the Tail Fin.
All hail, most golden dragon of the three-stage throne, keeper of the handle that, being pulled, spills all. Thy fins are the tallest of the tribe, thy crow most lustrous of all.
You will repeat after me your oath of office. O Keeper of the Candelabra, I most solemnly will try to keep my matches dry, and the candelabra lit, to keep my tail fins shining, with polish and with spit, and never touch the handle, that being pulled spills all, brother.
Thank you, Fuddley. Thank you, Crashaw, for your beautifully enacted illustration of my point. Now, this business of the social function of language can be described also as communication about communication. Indeed, this is what it is called in a book by Jürgen Rusch and Gregory Bateson called Communication, the Social Matrix of Psychiatry, in which they say that this kind of communication, which really doesn't communicate anything, does function in order to set up conditions for communication. So they call it meta-communication, or communication about communication. It seems to me rather important to understand the pre-symbolic elements that enter into our everyday speech and discourse. We cannot restrict ourselves to the giving and asking of factual information, after all. And if we tried to confine ourselves strictly to statements which are factually true, we'd find it even impossible to say pleased to meet you when the occasion demanded. The intellectually over-meticulous often say to us, you should say what you mean what you say, and you should only talk when you have something to say. These, it seems to me, are impossible prescriptions to be followed. Now, ignorance of the existence of these pre-symbolic functions of language seems to me to be more common among the educated than among the uneducated, who tend to see these things intuitively. You'll have observed that highly educated people often listen to the chatter at teas and cocktail parties and conclude from the triviality of the conversation that all the guests there, except themselves, are fools. These same educated people may go to church services and observe that very few people know what the sermon was about and remember it after it's over, and conclude from that that churchgoers are hypocrites. Or they may go to political rallies of the other party and decide from the string of cliches in political speeches that people who believe that stuff must be awfully stupid, and therefore that democracy couldn't possibly work. Now, it seems to me that all such unkind and unfavorable conclusions about the intelligence or the character of our friends and neighbors are based on pretty flimsy evidence, because these conclusions seem to me to be based upon applying to pre-symbolic language the criteria of meaningfulness that you should apply only to symbolic utterances. Note that there are differences in usage and kind of pre-symbolic language among different classes of society, in different ethnic groups, and in different parts of the country. In the United States, for example, there appear to me to be quite marked differences in the style and amount of pre-symbolic discourse between the general American public of the middle class and those styles that are common among immigrant groups, for example, who retain some of their old world habits. For example, Scandinavians in the Midwest, Jews in the New York garment district, Italians, Poles, Pennsylvania Dutch. Each of these groups seem to me to have a special form of, or style of pre-symbolic discourse of their own. And also there are occupational and class differences. The kind of social discourse common among, let's say, truck drivers, among women's clubs, among theatrical people, among writers and artists in urban bohemias, among naval officers and so on, are all quite different from each other. But we must understand these differences and adjust to them because they are all important communications about communication. One last point may make the whole idea clearer. Supposing you're struggling by the side of a road trying to change a flat tire. And let's suppose that a not very bright looking but friendly youth comes up and says, "Got a flat tire?" Well, if you interpret the question literally, it's a stupid question. I mean, anybody can see you've got a flat tire, and so you may resent the stupidity of the remark. And you might say something like, "Can't you see I have, you dumb ox?" Which would be, of course, the wrong answer. If we pay no attention to what the words say, however, and pay attention only to its meaning, we will return his gesture of friendly interest by showing equal friendliness. In a short time, he'll be helping us change the tire. Dr. Menninger, the psychoanalyst, gives this psychological translation of the meaning of "got a flat tire." It means something like this. "Hello, I see you're in trouble. I'm a stranger to you, but I might be your friend now that I have a chance to be, if I had any assurance that my friendship would be welcomed. Are you approachable? Are you a decent fellow? Would you appreciate it if I helped you?" This is what my voice sounds like. What does your voice sound like? And in a way, then, this is the psychological meaning. In a similar way, many situations in life demand that we pay no attention to what the words say, but that we attend rather to the psychological meanings underlying the whole thing. It's probable that a great deal of our pessimism about the stupidity of others is based upon the fact that we unconsciously apply the standards of symbolic language to utterances which are basically pre-symbolic in character.
Erglue, Ole Ugglebuggy. Howard's the Buddle Wallop Doddle.
Crasso, I know exactly what you mean, and I agree with you completely.
This is National Educational Television.